This is a huge obstacle, challenge. It can be the thing that really keeps people playing small, which is that voice of self-doubt. And one of the worst things about it is that most people would not even say, well, it's my voice of self-doubt. They would just say, what's keeping me back is that I'm not qualified enough. I'm not this. So we don't recognize it generally as a voice of self-doubt. We think it's our own best thinking, or we think it's like a fatal flaw of what's keeping me back is I'm not confident because I know I'm supposed to be confident.
It isn't about being perfect. It's about being better. Hello, my name is Dr. Stephanie Stima, and I host expert discussions with thought leaders in all facets of health, including nutrition, fitness, hormones, stress management, performance, recovery, longevity, health span, and energy production. On this show, we discuss complex science, but then we also alchemize it into actionable, everyday living. The ultimate goal with the show is to assist you in making informed decisions about your health and to catapult you into being the hero in your own life.
Hello, my Betties. Welcome back to another episode of Better with Dr. Stephanie. 'Tis me, your host, Dr. Stephanie Estima. And today we are talking about playing big in midlife. Oh, yes, we are. My guest today is Tara Mohr. She's an expert on women's leadership and well-being. She's the author of said book, Playing Big, Practical Wisdom for Women Who Want to Speak Up, Create, and Lead. Tara is the creator and teacher of the Global Playing Big Leadership Program for Women and the Playing Big Facilitators Training for coaches, therapists, managers, and mentors. She is a Coactive Training Institute certified coach with an MBA from Stanford University and has an undergraduate degree in English Lit from Yale. Her work has been featured on the New York Times, to the Today Show, Harvard Business Review, and she lives in San Fran with her husband and 3 children. So today we are talking all about what it is that keeps women specifically back from playing big. We talk about cultural influences. We talk about biological inputs. We talk about how we hold back and how we can begin to shed some of these layers as we are moving through perimenopause and menopause. When we sort of come back to who we are, we know what the cost is of deceiving ourselves, of betraying ourselves, and we are maybe thinking more about our mortality and the time that we have left and how we want to spend it. I found this to be an incredibly interesting conversation. Look out for the part of the conversation where we are talking about representation in film. Super fascinating. Please enjoy my conversation with Tara Mohr. All right, and we're live. Tara Mohr, welcome to the Better Podcast. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Today, we are going to be talking about your body of work, your book that came out a while ago now, which I still think is relevant in 2025 and beyond, Playing Big in Midlife. I want to start with a stat from your book, which I think was shocking to me when I read it. And that is from your research, you found that more than 40% of midlife women that you surveyed indicated that playing small in their lives is a top challenge for them. Can we expand a little bit on what it means first to be playing small? And then when we're saying this is a top challenge in our lives, maybe we can separate this into the verticals of our lives that really matter for women in midlife.
Great. Such a great way to begin. Yes, this statistic really surprised me too. And it helped birth the work that I've been doing for many years now. So when I had just started out, this is now 15 years ago, I knew I wanted to support women. I knew I wanted to support women around their inner lives, but I didn't know much more than that. And I had a small coaching practice. I had also started blogging, and the blog was growing. And I thought, well, I want to really know more about what's challenging my audience. So as is sometimes recommended, to ask your audience, what's the biggest challenge in your life? And I went through this process where I started by making a list of all the things that we conventionally talk about as the challenge in women's lives, right? Is it relationship issues, health issues, financial stress? Is it work-family balance, right? There was this checklist of what had been talked about. But then I looked at that list, and before I was going to press publish on the survey, I thought, gosh, there's nothing in this checklist that captures what I keep seeing in my coaching practice, which is this kind of generalized sense of, I know I'm holding back. I feel like I'm not really fully going for the life or career that I would go for if I was being my most courageous, authentic self. And I am a little stuck. I don't know exactly why I'm doing that or how to change it. So I had all of that in mind and I thought, well, how do you say that in a phrase that you can put on a survey? Well, playing small kind of gets at it. But even I was surprised when the survey results came back and people said, no, more frequently that I'm being challenged by all those other issues, I would say my top challenge is playing small. And I've done that survey over the years multiple times. I just did another version of it again this fall. And I thought maybe with everything that's going on in the world, women aren't feeling as challenged by that. But again, those same answers came back. So it's not only that we're playing small, I think it's also fascinating that we are aware that we're playing small. And it remains a persistent challenge. Like we're walking around going, I know I'm kind of playing small, but what do I do about that? And in terms of your question about the verticals, that can show up in a lot of ways. Are we doing the work that we love? Are we speaking up as much as we want to with our ideas? Are we making the contributions, whether through paid work or community work or creative endeavors? Are we making the contribution that we really feel called to make? It can, of course, show up in our healthcare journey. You know, do I play small in a conversation with a doctor? Do I say what I really think? Do I ask the third or fourth question, even though I feel like I already took up too much time? And in fact, when I ask women, what does playing big mean to you? What they overwhelmingly say is it means creating more of the whole life I desire. It's not, of course, about the old definitions of big title or bigger paycheck. It's really this inwardly defined and really cross-domain of our lives, creating the lives that we truly desire.
So as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about some of the personality traits that women tend, I mean, I'm going to be painting some broad strokes here, but, you know, women tend to be more nurturers. We tend to be more agreeable. Is this like a nature versus nurture question in terms of why we don't speak up, why we don't feel like we ask the third question at the doctor's office, why we don't feel like we are the first to speak, let's say, in a meeting, why we don't go for the things that we desire? Is that something to do maybe with our inherent biology as females, right? Or is it a result of conditioning in society? Like, why is it that women don't speak up and sort of chase after the things that we desire in the way that we want to, or the way that we feel like we should be doing?
Right. It's such a great question. And I think it's an open question. And, you know, when you think about epigenetics, it kind of nature and nurture get collapsed into each other, right? So our epigenetic lineage as women is certainly that we've been socialized to think about others' needs before our own, you know, to read the room super carefully before we read ourselves. We might never even get around to reading ourselves.
If at all.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And we also have really good historical data. And I think that memory of that lives in us, that speaking up can be dangerous and rocking the boat can be dangerous. I mean, I often say, how did women ensure our survival? We didn't do it by physical might. We didn't do it through financial power. We didn't have that. We didn't necessarily do it through political power if we couldn't even vote. How did we survive? Well, we kind of shape-shifted to adapt to what we needed to adapt to in the cultures and systems of power around us. We did it through, in a way, relational power, being liked, being acceptable. But here we are in this kind of new historical moment where maybe we want to hang on to some of that and we may want to let some of that go. And what was actually dangerous in the past is, for many of us, not truly dangerous anymore, but we have a lot of that fear instinct and conditioning around it. The reason I would, also put a question mark around, is this just biological, is that there's a lot of research that shows that, for example, when women are in single sex groups in educational environments, they don't experience some of that same holding back or self-doubt. So that goes a little bit more to, what's the social context and how is that making us feel about ourselves? How do we see ourselves because of the cues we get in the environment and all of that?
Okay. And so if we are thinking about playing bigger in our lives and going after the things that we desire, why is it something that we need to consider in midlife?
Yeah. Well, I would say it's a special opportunity and crossroads to consider it in midlife. One, there's that beautiful thing that happens where we start to know ourselves better than we did before. We know more about who we really are and what brings us joy. We've been around the block enough times that we know the costs of self-betrayal. We know how it feels. And in 2025, midlife means we've still got a whole lot of time in front of us to intentionally choose how we're going to live it. So to me, it's all those things in combination that make it an especially opportune time. And I think, as you probably see with your guests and your experts, it kind of feels like in midlife, change comes calling for us no matter what. Like developmentally, we are pushed to up level. And so it's not really a question of, is the change, are changes going to happen for you or not, but just how are you going to choose to respond? What path are you going to take at that midlife crossroads?
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm reminded of a couple of guests who've been on the show who've talked about the grandmother hypothesis, where in midlife, of course, we lose our reproductive capacity, but the grandmother hypothesis postulates that maybe we're no longer reproductive, but we're incredibly productive. We can be incredibly productive in our communities. We can be productive in our families. We can help, daughters who are having children. We can help with the child rearing. We can help with the cooking, all the things that we do, maybe so well in a cultural aspect and also in a societal aspect as well. And I think that, if I can interpret what you're saying, and certainly you can correct me if I get this wrong, is in midlife, and my understanding of sort of the neurological changes that happen as well is, at least in the perimenopausal transition, it can be a little bit more vacillating in terms of how we feel about things as we're going through a lot of these biological changes. We're losing some of our sex hormones. Maybe there's other big life events that happen, divorce, moving, all of the things. But once we sort of get to the after party, if you will, once we're in menopause and we're a little bit more stable, this is really a time where we can say, okay, so some of the needs that my children may be needed from me for the decades that I have been serving them no longer exist, and now I have a little bit more time and a little bit more space to really come back to myself and say, what is it that I really want to do with the time that I have left here?
Absolutely.
And I'm not quite, and just to sort of finish the thought, and I'm so happy to hear that you agree, I'm not quite in menopause yet, but I do find myself like thinking about mortality. It's like, okay, I'm almost 50 years old. Like I'm not that far away from that marker. And that's more than midlife, right? So what am I going to be doing? What am I going to be doing with the time that I have left?
I'm so glad you're sharing all of that. And the other pieces it makes me think about is, not only are we not as taxed on a daily basis by caregiving sometimes at that stage of life, but we're bringing with us everything we learned from the caregiving years, which is so much wisdom that our world needs. The things that we learn from the caregiving years are not really the principles that run our world, that run the political realm or the professional realm. We could talk about more of what those are, but there's such a lack in the culture to bring the wisdom of what you learn through those hard caregiving years, I think, forward into the broader societal realm in new ways. And as you're talking about, we're not only aware of mortality, but then that we start thinking about legacy. And I find that, for women, often I don't hear them talking about legacy as like, what building could permanently have my name etched into it so that my ego feels, certain that I'm living on. They're thinking about legacy like, I love my children and grandchildren. I love all children. What's the world we're leaving for them? And so many of us, I think, start to think about the long-term future beyond us in new ways, and how do we want to spend our time and energies contributing to something that will be meaningful around that.
Yeah, I have this conversation sometimes with my husband. It's something like, we'll question each other. Like, he asked me the other day, like, what do you think your greatest purpose is? And, now in midlife where I'm thinking a little bit about this more. Certainly my career is very important to me. There's no way I would never not do this podcast. It satisfies my intellectual desire to learn. I'm an eternal student. And I won't say but, I'll say and. My greatest joy is seeing my children thrive. Like my greatest joy is doing all the time that I poured into my children, sort of watching them grow up and see bits of the evidence of the moral compass that I've installed into them. So I don't have desires to have my name on a building, but to your point, I do love the idea of, my lived experience being transmuted through my children and having them build on that in the span of their lives as well.
That is such a beautiful, I think, based in the feminine revisioning of the concept of legacy, that legacy comes through love. And it's the way the essence of our being gets imparted to other people, whether we did that as a parent or as a teacher of a course or as a voice that people listen to in their ear in their podcast. It's like something about the energetic essence of us, we were able to transmit outside so that it's in the energetic essence of others, and those others go on to hopefully do the same. I think, I call that the other immortality, and it's very relational. And I think we need to lean into it more. Yeah.
I love that. it was interesting. Last night I was on a panel. We were talking about menopause and perimenopause and hormone therapy and the intersection of pharmacology and lifestyle. And I had some people come up to me afterwards, like, you're so confident. Like I love, cause I'm the first person, I'm like, I have something to say about this. Like there was a question posed to the three doctors on the stage, and I would jump to answer it. And, I had a couple of people reflect that back to me, like, you're so confident. Like, how do you do that? You're not even fidgeting on stage, anything like that. So coming back to some of your work around playing big, and that's not something I've worked on. I'm like, don't fidget. Like I wasn't, just
right.
Like, I have so much to say about this. But if we have, we lovingly call our community our Betties who listen to the Better podcast. So our Betties who are listening that maybe they have that sort of inner, that inner gremlin, that inner critic that's always like, you're not enough, you're not pretty enough, not smart enough, not enough, like you're not enough in some realm.
Yeah.
How do we begin to, I don't want to say annihilate that voice, because it is useful insofar as, it wants to keep us safe. But how do we start? Is there another voice that's in there that maybe we can start paying attention to? Or maybe the question I'm getting at is, how do we quiet that self-doubt? How do we get closer to playing big? If we have these big desires that maybe we're keeping close to our hearts that we would never dare admit because it's too scary to admit how big our desires are, how do we start to move towards that through quieting self-doubt and maybe listening if there are other voices in there, or encouraging a different narrative, let's say?
Yes. Great. So absolutely, this is a huge obstacle, challenge. It can be the thing that really keeps people playing small, which is that voice of self-doubt. And one of the worst things about it is that most people would not even say, well, it's my voice of self-doubt. They would just say, what's keeping me back is that I'm not qualified enough. I'm not this. So we don't recognize it generally as a voice of self-doubt. We think it's our own best thinking, or we think it's like a fatal flaw of what's keeping me back is I'm not confident, because I know I'm supposed to be confident. And so it can hold us back in any or all of those ways. And, it's pretty striking. I go into so many rooms and talk about the inner critic, and then I'll ask women, just like, tell me what your inner critic says. And if I'm, teaching online, people will stream things into the chat or say them into the room if I'm in a room, and it is just, no one wants to hear from you. You're not good at that. Your English isn't good enough for you to even speak in the meeting. You got hired by accident. It's all of those things. And they become like the background music that we're just living with, that we don't even notice anymore. So a couple things. The first is, as you're already pointing to, we want to start to think of that as a voice within us, not our best thinking. and not even really an essential personality quality of lack of confidence, because that's not super actionable. There's no formula for becoming confident, and all the research shows that achievement and awards and accolades and climbing whatever ladder does not impact confidence. So don't wait for that. That's not going to get you there, much as we think it will. Arguing with your inner critic doesn't tend to get you there. So we're not thinking about it as a personality quality that we need to change and get confident, but really starting to go, okay, there's a voice. And I like to think of it for myself. It just helps me. I like to think of it as like a little pinpoint in my head. Like I picture it as small. So just landscape wise, it's like I've got a very big brain. And then there's this one point that is this mental chatter, self-critical narrative that I can put all my attention there, or I can right size it again. And it is, as you're saying, it's part of our safety instinct, but it's not a helpful part. So I'm sure, right, many episodes of your show have talked about our flight or fight response and the nervous system, right, and how that response that was designed to help us evade physical threats, unfortunately, still is what fires when we face an emotional threat. So you face the emotional threat, let's say, of, I want to start a business, but there's an emotional threat. It might fail. No one might show up. I want to speak up in the meeting, but there's an emotional threat. People in the room might think my idea is crazy. What your body's going to do, if you perceive that as a threat, is go, oh, we need adrenaline, we need cortisol, we need to, maybe we need to throw a punch or fight a kick, maybe we need to sprint away. And basically you're going to have the physical response that's going to be the least helpful to you with that emotional threat, because you're mobilized to fight a physical threat. Your higher level cognition shuts down. You can't think clearly, right? We've all had this experience. Why couldn't I even remember my thoughts, right? When I got nervous, you can't emotionally connect when you're in that fear threatened state. So you have none of what you need. Okay, so that's problematic. And then what's also problematic is, and that this we don't talk about as much, one of the costumes our safety instinct puts on, one of the tactics it uses is the inner critic. And so your safety instinct, because it's just saying, just go back into your comfort zone, just don't do anything that feels emotionally threatening. It can't do that super obviously or transparently because you wouldn't listen to it, but it can say, oh, you have no idea what you're talking about. Don't say that. Get 5 more years experience first. Don't send the job, application in. And through that, it can get us to retreat back into a zone that feels better for the safety instinct, but is not better for us as whole people. And sometimes I say, if you've ever worked in like a bureaucratic corporation where there need to be departments talking to each other, but they're not, sometimes you can think of yourself that way. Like there's the safety instinct department. And then there's your fulfillment and your self-actualization. Well, which department should be directing the show, right? The whole person fulfillment. But the safety instinct can hijack things and doesn't really care if you have a fulfilled or joyful or self-actualized life. It's only concerned with sort of the metric, so to speak, of safety and its perception of survival, which was never designed for our 2025 emotional threats anyway. So, given all of that, I have, after a lot of coaching people around the inner critic, really evolved to, since our safety instinct isn't going away and our emotional risk-taking, hopefully, if we're living our lives, it's not going away, then we're really not trying to graduate from having the inner critic. We're just trying to relate to it more wisely. And it will be there. It will be there when you're doing the most important leaps in your life. Your inner critic will be there chattering away. So what do? We notice and name it. We can create a character that personifies it and playfully work with that character. We check what's the fear underneath and respond to that with a lot of compassion. And we also connect with our values and our desire to serve. And I think that shows up in a really interesting way, Stephanie, in the example you gave of this panel, because it sounded to me like it was not you self-assessing and going, I know, I'm good enough, and that's why I'm going to speak. It wasn't about self-assessment. It was, I think I have something valuable to share. And also you lit up, like it's fun to share it. And I would say those are both values. Those are both intrinsic to you. They're intrinsic to your experience of how that panel feels to you. It's not you going outside yourself and going, did I decide I measure up to speak?
Yes, that is very on point. And I will, in the spirit of honesty, say that it was not always that way. I remember the first time that I got up in front of my husband runs big events. He'd asked me to speak at one of his big events. There was 1,500 people there, and I was literally shaking. I was on stage. I brought papers with me because I was so scared I was going to forget everything I was going to say. And literally the only thing that got me on that stage that day, like Giovanni, my husband, had to coach me onto the stage. I was so scared, was that it wasn't actually about me getting, like, he was like, you have so much information and wisdom from your, professional, schooling and your experience as a clinician, et cetera, et cetera. It's not about you at all. It's about, like, he's like, just pretend that 1,499 people are not going to take anything away from this. And there's just one person I'm even just like crying saying this, but he's like, like I'm trying, like, I feel like the tears like getting really hot in my eyes as I'm saying this, but there's one person in the audience that day that like really needs to hear what you have to say. And that's literally the only thing that got me on the stage that day. I was so petrified, and I was like, actually, this has nothing to do with me.
Yes.
Like, I am not even an important part of this equation. It's just about like connecting with that one person. 1,499, they're like all X's, but there's one person in the audience that's like, oh my God, yes, that's what I need. That's my next step. I have my next step.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And that's, the pithy way I often like to think of that and remember it is that the goal is not to think better of ourselves. The goal is to think bigger than ourselves. And that's how we don't actually counter self-doubt thought by thought. We leapfrog over it by connecting with something that is so much bigger and more powerful. It naturally displaces any thinking that we're doing about ourselves.
Yes, that is so important. I have a question for you about men. Like, do men have the same, I have not observed this to be true, but I also am not in the research in the way that maybe you are. Do men have the same kind of self-doubt and inner critic that women do? Because I find that women are so much more filtered in the information that they want to share. They feel like they might be attacked from other men, other women, do we see the same kind of patterning with men, or is it just something that we put on ourselves?
Yeah.
Do we do it to ourselves more? Like what is going on there? What's the gender difference?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So I'll tell you, first of all, the research on this is not as good as you or I would hope it would be. I think this is such a central topic. You'd think that there would just be a very wide body of research. But for the most part, the ways that the research is looking at the kind of thing we're talking about, it's through lenses like imposter syndrome or self-efficacy. It's not exactly getting at this inner critical voice and how does it show up in so many different domains of our lives, and really doing gendered comparison. So that's number one. But there is some interesting research that suggests that men feel more self-doubt around the things that we are primed to associate with femininity in our culture, and that women feel more self-doubt around the kinds of skills that we get conditioned to associate with masculinity. So I'll explain what I mean. And this is coming from an interesting study where women and men were paired up to do a mock negotiation that was a buyer and seller type negotiation. So the buyer is trying to get the best price and the seller is trying to get the highest price, and you see how everybody fares. And you can see that if you send those pairs off with the instruction of, you're being a great negotiator requires reading nonverbal cues and good emotional interpersonal skills, the men essentially go into more of a fight or flight response hearing that, and they perform worse in the negotiation and set their targets lower. Whereas if you keep things neutral, what you see in most negotiation studies is that women experience more of that fight or flight response because we get so many messages that negotiation is adversarial and it's more of a masculine domain. And so women tend to set their bars lower. But if you change those cues to say, hey, negotiation relies on all these traditional feminine qualities, you see that kind of self-doubt response get activated in the men. It's pretty fascinating. So that's a good place to land in how we think of the distinctions. And there's other research that supports that. If you're talking about the kinds of activities that the culture, through TV, movies, books, cultural messaging, the things that the culture says again and again, those are masculine domains: leadership, negotiation, quantitative work, scientific work, financial tasks. There we do tend to see women having more self-doubt. And if you go to the opposite domains, you might see the opposite, where men are having more of that response.
This is so rampant in movies.
Yes.
Any movie, like once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's like there's some crescendo, some conflict, and then the protagonist and then the woman will turn to the man and say, what do we do now? And it's literally like every movie where there's a man and a woman, the woman at some point is like, what do we do now? Like, first of all, have you ever seen a mom where there's like their child is in trouble and
Right.
she's like, I don't know what to do right now. No, she's like lunging, she's lifting the car, she's
Right.
like, she's saving the child, whatever. But in movies, we see it all the time. And I remember, I think it was Reese Witherspoon sort of first brought it to my attention. I heard a clip of her saying it. And then literally like Love Actually, there's the Toy Story, like any movie where there's a female and there's like some crisis. She's like, what do we do now? And it's like, that's no woman ever does that. Like if there's a crisis, you can better believe that the woman is usually on the front lines, especially if it's her child, especially if it's something that's very valuable to her. She's trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
But that's what we're sort of, I don't know if it's a subconscious, I don't know what it is, but it's literally everywhere. It's a mind virus.
It's very, yeah. And we get heavily primed in that. So it's this idea that we don't have agency. And then also, I think what a lot of movies tell us is that your plot line as a woman is going to be entirely dependent on who thinks you're beautiful or sexy. Like you may get picked up in the
Right.
plot of life or not, depending on that. You may get rescued or not, depending on that, which is, obviously not a great message. And the other thing, right, we've seen from movies and with the Bechdel test, which looks at do two women ever talk to each other in a movie? And most movies fail this. So there's like this whole realm of the relationship between women. Yeah, it's fascinating. I think that there's some bar that they put in the test, like do they talk to each other for more than, 2 seconds? And the vast majority of movies fail. And I was just even recently, I was thinking about, I was listening to a podcast. It's called How to Survive the End of the World podcast, and it's two sisters host the podcast. And they did this series with pairs of sisters who are amazing activists. And I learned about like there were all of these incredible, sister to sister projects that have been birthed and ways they supported each other. And it was just so stunning to me because I thought, I've never seen this in a television show or a movie. I have never seen a plot line driven by a pair of sisters. And so we all know as women, how rich our relationships are with our friends and the other women and our family members. And that's just kind of been erased from our map of how stories happen.
Yeah. And it's even when I'm like any movie with sisters, I'm like, I think there was like The Switch. There was like, there's always twins. Like there's, I'm thinking of like the Lindsay Lohan, they were switched at birth and like they met each other but they're again, it's like they're not helping or supporting each other.
No.
They're just like, who are you? You look exactly like I do.
It's not them as an amazing duo team. Yeah. Or it's the opposite where they're at each other's throat and there's, it's always the evil stepsisters
Right.
and that whole narrative. Yeah.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting. Okay. So we have this programming. There's this sort of narrative. We have our own musical, as you mentioned, there's this own musical tapestry in the background that is singing all the time about how we're not good enough, how we're not strong enough, how we're not pretty enough, smart enough, etc. How do we start to, maybe it's mothering ourselves, mentoring ourselves, healing whatever that lineage is in us that keeps us from sort of self-actualizing? How do we now begin to maybe nurture a different voice?
Yeah. Such a beautiful question. So, in the work that I do, we go to something that I've come to call the inner mentor voice. And this is about connecting with a vision or sense of yourself that is your older, can be your, and I put in quotes, your older. It's really like your inner wise woman self. It's also your more essential self. Sometimes age is a nice tool to help people get there, like to just say, okay, imagine yourself way out into the future. And when people are in a relaxed, meditative kind of state, and we usually do this through a guided visualization, what almost always happens for women is that a very clear and kind of surprising figure shows up that feels to them like a very palpably loving, wise, centered human that may also show them some things that are uncomfortable, like, she's painting and that intimidates me, or she, is really into nature and I'm an urban girl, or right. So she can be provocative in that way. And we can get a really good felt sense of her and then relate to her and consult with her like a mentor and really envision and think about, okay, how would she write this difficult email? How would she move through this health crisis? How does she approach this challenging situation in my divorce? And it's an incredibly powerful way of not only getting to wisdom, but really like what's the just right wisdom for that person, because she's our unique individual wise self for each of us, and that's just irreplaceable.
I love that. It's reminiscent a little bit of alter egos, right? So it's funny, without, obviously in preparing for our show today, I've heard you talk about some of these concepts. And before knowing you, I would talk about this inner wise woman as well. And I don't think I would use exactly the same, but I would use prompts like, what would Wonder Woman do? If I envision myself as a grandmother and it's like I have the long flowing hair and I have wrinkles everywhere and I have a long flowy muumuu and there's like a big pendant, some crystal or something that's hanging around my neck, and I speak to her, what would she tell me?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, it's an there's a bit of like an alter ego essence to what you're saying, which I like. And, you see this in sports performance. We see a lot of, I believe it was it LeBron? No, not LeBron. Who was the Black Mamba? I forget his name. Kobe Bryant. So before he would step onto the basketball court, he was like, all right, now I'm Black Mamba. Like I am this, killer, right? So I'm going to go on the basketball court and I am just going to like wipe it up. I'm going to own it. So I think that there's something there where we can enact different parts of us, different pieces of us, even people that we aspire to. I do this a little bit with my boys with soccer. It's like when you step on the pitch, you're no longer, your names, you are now, Cristiano Ronaldo, or whoever it is, right? Maybe not Ronaldo, but like, some of their favorite defense fullbacks and whatever, because those are their positions.
Yeah, I think they both can be powerful. Sometimes we could source from an external person, whether that's, thinking about a spiritual figure or someone from the public realm that we really admire. And it is pretty fascinating that we each can come up with our own version of that is the more fully expressed us. Because of course, we kind of take pieces of what inspires us or resonates with us from those external figures, but nobody's the whole package of our destined path. There's that beautiful image that Joseph Campbell talked a lot about the oak tree and the acorn, right? And the acorn is got all the information that it needs within it to become that full oak tree. And so for each of us, the question is like, what's your oak tree self that you're growing into? And how do you get a sense of that? And this is one powerful way to do that. And then to step more and more into that self's choices.
How do we as women who are often so dependent on external validation and external cues. So we're reading people's faces all the time. We're getting information about how they think about us. We are listening for verbal feedback. You did great. You didn't do great. This praise, this praise and criticism. You talk about this idea of unhooking ourselves from praise and criticism. How might that be another step in our stepping stone to living big and playing big?
Yeah. So this also surprised me. And this came up in my early coaching work where people kept coming with situations that were really about how were they relating to praise and criticism. So that might sound like, one woman said, I love my job, but the culture at my company is just, now that I'm at a senior level, everybody's giving each other kind of tough feedback all the time. I love the actual work, but I am awake all night ruminating over this person's feedback comment and that person. Do I have to quit my job? Even though it doesn't seem like I should quit my job, I love the actual work. So for her, it was like, wait, what's this new arena where criticism is going to come my way? And how do I need to change to make peace with that or find a way to relate to it? Or for someone else, it was, I had another woman I was working with who had worked in domestic violence prevention for 20 years. And she had her critiques of the conventional approaches and she wanted to do something innovative. And she said, I know even my most precious mentors who have cheered me on my whole career, they're not going to totally agree with some of the things I want to try that are really different. And I am having so much trouble not procrastinating, moving forward on this because I'm so scared of that. So it can show up in a lot of different ways, but it started to really show itself as a pattern that for each of us, if we're really going to step into our playing big, there's something that has to be changed or upgraded about how we relate to what other people think of us. It's like a rite of passage on the path. And that's what led to really making this unhooking from praise and criticism part of that playing big process. And my favorite concept, my favorite tool to use there is simply this idea that the feedback we get tells us about the people who are giving the feedback. It doesn't really illuminate anything essential about us. And by essential, I mean in our essence, not whether it's important or not. And that's pretty different from where, we go by default. Where we usually go by default is, if I got lots of downloads on my podcast, it means I'm good at podcasting. If I was invited back to speak again, it means, I'm a good enough speaker. If nobody wants to publish my book, it probably means I'm not a good writer. But can you see, like in each of those, we're missing the huge opportunity to learn about the people we're trying to reach. It's like, oh, my podcast got a lot of downloads. What I'm doing is clearly working for some people. Who is it working for? And what about it is working? Like that's where the learning is. Or nobody wants to publish my book. What am I learning about what publishers want right now? Or, I didn't get any calls back on my resume. Okay, what can I find out about what hiring managers are looking for? So it's a much more emotionally neutral and in a sense, a much more strategic way of looking at feedback and not going on the emotional roller coaster with it. It's especially important for women because we know from a host of research that women get more negative feedback in the workplace than men by far. And even more dramatically, with some of where we see the most dramatic gender differences is that the feedback that women get tends to be much more personal and personality oriented. So, for example, one study showed that among negative comments in performance reviews, for women, about 73% of them have to do with personality or style. For men, that number is something more like 2 to 4%. And personality or style means you're too aggressive, you're too direct, you're abrasive, you don't have executive presence, you're passive, you're too quiet. Things that are not directly tied often to job outcomes or job expectations, but are more like someone just weighing in on how you show up and the way you do what you do. So for women especially, it's very important that we not take all that on and not go on an emotional roller coaster with it.
It's almost like, how will I articulate this? It's almost like women are a problem to solve and men just need to be shown the way. and I say this because when I look at some of the topics, let's say you're playing big in midlife, let's say, if I were to, and I haven't done this, so I don't know if this is true or not, but I would bet that what you're talking about here, a lot of the notes of what you're talking about, making up this melody, if this was written by, let's say, a male author, this might be found in the leadership section. And if it's written towards women, we might find it in the self-help section of the bookstore. And it's almost like this: men just need to be shown the way. They just have these tools to unlock. And once they know the way, once they have the template, leadership has been unlocked, versus women who are just constant problems that need to be solved for. Too much, too loud, and I would assume in midlife, this becomes menopause and beyond, because you just literally don't give any F's anymore. And so that might come across as abrasive, being a bitch, all the other words that you might think about to describe a woman who is setting boundaries for herself. And I think that, you mentioned like her personality, and I also think you said the way that she dresses. Is that what they will receive comments on their presence? Is
that can happen? Executive presence, which is kind of an interesting combination of tone of voice, how you present yourself and show up. Yeah, and you can guess, who executive presence normally ends up looking like.
Right. Because leadership can look different. There's many different flavors to leadership. It's not just like the light blue button-up shirt with the neutral tie and blazer. There's a lot of different ways that can look like. Yeah. Okay. So we're thinking about now nurturing this inner mentor. We're thinking about unhooking from praise and criticism, and the criticism now looks less like feedback that's that says anything about us, but more about the person who's giving the feedback and the schemas and the filters that they're sort of working through. What are ways that we can, are there ways when we are thinking about feedback? Like if we, for example, if everybody stopped downloading my show tomorrow, let's say, because we do look at downloads, like I will say, we have a monthly podcast meeting. We look at stats. We look at what are things that are performing well? What is the audience like? What do they don't like? What do they want more of? What do they want less of? Is there a way, let's say for, I'll use the podcast as an example. Is there a way for me to unhitch the data from what like I've said a couple of times, I love doing this podcast. This is like my favorite, like the favorite part of my work. And I don't think I would ever, I think even if, 4 people downloaded it, I'd probably still do it because I just love it that much. But is there a way, if we were to expand that into unhitching or unhooking from praise and feedback from people, how do we then begin to cultivate more of an endogenous, like more of an internal praise and criticism? And how can we begin to trust those voices to make sure that we're navigating and we're moving in the right direction?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think what you're saying is such a beautiful reflection of it, because we do want to take feedback seriously if it's helping us have the impact we are wanting to have or helping us achieve our goals. So often, because of that socialization we've been talking about today, women have this barely conscious belief, and maybe totally unconscious, that's like being a nice person is taking everybody's feedback into account. If I have any respect for you as a human being, I have to care what your opinion is. And I am very encouraging of being like, no, you actually don't have time for that. There is too much feedback and too little time. But what we do want to think about are what are your goals and values and which feedback is truly relevant to you. So for you, if you were to say, I just love to do the podcast, I don't care whether anyone listens or not, then great, you get to do the podcast with joy. If you wanted to say, no, my goal is to do the podcast and reach and have it resonate with people, I'm going to look at the feedback that helps me know how to do that. But what's critical is that you're not taking that feedback as information about whether you measure up in some way, whether it's time for your inner critic to run. You're just understanding it as, oh, that's interesting data about my audience. And that actually allows you to use it, to get curious about it, to find out more. And that's the switch that a lot of us have to make.
And what about, like, there's some criticism, like I'll say, sometimes I make the mistake of reading the comments, which is like number one rule of being on social media, never read the comments. But sometimes I get in there. And by the way, some of the comments that people leave on YouTube are absolutely wild. Shame on you. I mean, for the most part, they're largely positive, but the negative ones are like, she looks like this and she's too talkative. And it's like, it's my podcast. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk on my podcast.
Right.
But what about, so some of those are silly. Like some of those, like, just roll off my, like, water off of a duck's back. I don't care about that stuff. And then there's some criticism that I'm like, oh, that actually really hurts. Like there's some that really sting. So what is when do we, like, are we saying that we never want to listen to any of them? Like, okay, the people that are like crazy, the keyboard cowboys, I'm not gonna worry about that. But there are some that get in and I'm like, that was ouchy. That hurt.
Can you give me an example?
Well, okay. So I recently posted, this was on Instagram, and I posted a recipe. It was like a cauliflower base for a pizza, and it was like a meat lovers pizza, whatever. So I'm cooking it, and I put it in the air fryer, and then I bring it out, and literally the major signal like that came out of that comments was, I can't believe that you are using an air fryer. Like, I follow all your content and I thought that you were smart, and here you are using an air fryer. And I was like, what the hell? And I was so bothered by it. And I was like, why is this bothering me? Is it because I am using, is it like, am I stupid or something? Like, have I chosen like the wrong appliance to make this cauliflower pizza in? And then I think what I ended up sort of landing on was the comments that were coming through, like, oh my God, aren't you worried about like the forever chemicals and whatever? Like, I had specifically chosen that air fryer for it not to be, like the PFAS and like those forever chemicals. But I was like, maybe that does sting because I should have used the oven, and I was like going for convenience and I was going quicker. And maybe that means that somehow I didn't, like, it's not as good of a recipe as if I did it more of the traditional way. Like I was sort of like, why is this bothering me? And I think I ended up landing on this idea that, well, I am a health expert. I should have known better. Maybe that is why maybe I should have used like a stainless steel appliance instead of one that, even though it's nonstick, and it's PFAS free, there are still, potential chemicals in there. So
yeah,
that's a recent one.
Yeah, great. So I could think, two approaches you could take. So one would be to just say, okay, what is this feedback telling me about the person or people who gave it? And that could just be like, yeah, there is a constituency out there that feels really strong about air fryers. That's what that's telling me. And that it kind of doesn't have all that much to do with me. So that, and just noticing as you try on that reframe and really go, oh yeah, some people are really concerned and worried about the air fryers. Maybe some people don't know that there's different kinds of air fryers. Okay. Mm-hmm. And does that just create a little release of like, that's not about me? The second thing is what you, in a sense, were already doing, which is I call finding the matchup, which is when criticism really stings, we can ask ourselves, what belief is that mirroring? Like what belief that I hold about myself is that poking at? And so something maybe about, am I really a legit health expert, or do I have to always get it right to be the health expert, or am I making decisions too quickly? And what's cool about that is when we see that, I call that finding the matchup, when we see the matchup between what happened externally and what it poked at internally, it's such a great opportunity to heal whatever that internal thing is and re-examine it. So that's the opportunity. It's like the outside life thing that happened caused us to get triggered in that place. And then we can go, what is that? Oh, I see. I have a belief that, I'm the health expert, therefore I'm always supposed to make the perfect decision.
Yeah.
And where that idea come from? And what new belief would I like to replace that with? Maybe the new belief is I'm a health expert on my imperfect journey with all my listeners, and sharing as I learn is where the joy is. Oh, that feels more loving and more forgiving, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I sort of landed on like, I do enough right in my life that I can afford the occasional air fryer use. That's sort of where I landed on it. But in the beginning, I was like, oh, this one kind of hurts. Like, why is everyone talking about that? But I like the reframe, and I like because when something stings, when you get offended by something, there's some truth in whatever was said that you also believe about it in yourself too. And there was one comment that was like, I love everything you do, but I'm so disappointed that you use this thing. And I was like, oh, why is she disappointed? I don't want to disappoint her. And I was like, actually, I don't care. And then I was sort of doing this little soul searching and all the things that I was just expressing to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. And I like the other thing that you said too. And I think that a lot of women do fall for this, I'll say trick, is that we do need to be nice. And in order to be nice, we need to take everybody's feedback and everybody's things into consideration. I think about the distinction, and I actually talk about this with my family, like privately, around this distinction between being kind and being nice. Being nice is being a pushover, and being kind is stating what you feel because you respect the other person enough and that you respect yourself enough, and doing the thing that you feel is right. That's kindness. Yeah. Being aloof, passive aggressive, saying things that you mean saying things you don't mean when you really mean something else, that's not kind. Yeah. I like to make that distinction between kindness and niceness, which I think is conflated often with women.
Yes. I think that's a great distinction. And as you're pointing out, it's like if all we were talking about was actually being nice, that would also be fine. But what we're really talking about is the way that women feel they always have to have the defining quality of whatever they're saying or doing be that it was nice, by which they mean it didn't feel scary for me to say, it didn't possibly rock the boat, it wasn't something that you might not like, which, some things are nice and they're also what other people don't like. It's all those ways that idea of niceness confines us. And there's a really interesting body of research looking at what's often talked about as the double bind for women. And this is this idea that women tend to be perceived as competent or likable, but not both. So you can think about sort of the stereotypes of this in our culture, like people often think of, right, Miranda Priestly, Devil Wears Prada, the Meryl Streep character. She's the highly competent woman, but the cost of that, what we're taught is the cost is that she's the ice queen and she's alone and she's not a nice person. Or maybe we can have, grandma or the secretary in the office. She can be nice, but she's not highly competent and powerful. And we actually see in studies that this is a real double bind that women face. It comes through in their performance reviews. It comes through in how people see them in the workplace. And it is not true in whatever is the highest status or dominant group in a society. So in our cultures, that's often white men, right? White men, we don't have a problem seeing competence and niceness go together. It's why we can elect a president, because he's a great guy. I want to have a beer with him, right? That's what we said in the United States with some of our recent elections. He's such a nice guy. I want to have a beer with him, and then he'll also be able to be a great president. And we really still struggle with that with women, seeing both. So part of what's going on with niceness is that it's like women know in their bones that we're always navigating that double bind. If I'm just being sheer competent and I'm not dumbing anything down and I'm getting things done and I'm saying what I need to say and I'm not sugarcoating, that is also going to translate into me being perceived as unlikable. Right? This is also why the girl that, gets all the straight A's and raises her hand always, she's not going to be the popular one. She's not going to be the one that people like. We learn that early. And so we're always doing this strange tiptoeing and dance. It's why we're editing our emails 900 times to make the extra emojis and make sure we said it nicely. And I don't want to bother you, but it's like, if I just lean into the competent side, I'm going to pay. And of course, even if you're not a people pleaser, you're a human being. You want to be liked. You want to know that you're embraced by your human community. So it's a really difficult, persistent one to navigate. And the last thing I'll say about it that just also makes things even more thick and complex, and that I know many of us have experienced, is that this is not a phenomenon that we see in just how men see women. It is how women see other women. If you have a female boss, it's your performance review from her is going to reflect often that double bind. So that makes it really tricky around all this niceness stuff and around our playing big.
It's the Barbie monologue.
Yes, it's very connected to that.
Be pretty, but not too pretty, because then you're going to isolate all your female friends. Be smart, but not too smart. Be aggressive, but don't be a bitch. It's like there's always a moving target, and it weathers you. You know, it just wears you down.
It's very taxing. And I don't want to be too pessimistic about it. I want to also say, I think women are making really big strides in bringing together all their personable warmth skills and showing their competence. That's really, I think, the best model we have is get away from nice, but think about warmth and how do you communicate your warmth and your competence. And if you want to get more tactical about it, it's often a good technique to think about at the beginning of an interaction, really leading with warmth, because that's what people assess first is likability. And then you have a little more time, whether it's in a meeting or an email or a relationship, to move from expressing that warmth to really conveying your competence. So there's lots of ways we can work with it. It's also a reason a lot of women, choose entrepreneurial paths, because you actually have more room to express your competence without dealing with how everybody reacts to that.
And you can check out of the corporate culture.
Yeah.
You can check out of that. That's great. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I think very illuminating for all of my Betties who are listening. If people want to learn more about you and your work, where can we find you online on the interwebs?
I'd love to meet some of the Betties at taramohr.com, TARAMOHR.com. And you can also get the Playing Big book anywhere that you like to get your books.
Tara, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and your presence today.
Thank you. It's been a total pleasure.